The evening sun was beginning to sink, casting long golden lines across the quiet road as the judge drove home. He had just finished a long day in court, the kind that drained a person in ways they didn't notice until they sat alone in their car. He loosened his tie a little and let the cool air from the AC calm him. He looked forward to reaching home, maybe reheating the leftover soup in his fridge, maybe reading a few pages from the book he had been struggling to finish for weeks. Nothing exciting, just peace. That was all he wanted. The road ahead was mostly empty. Trees swayed to the side, and small houses appeared now and then between long stretches of open land. He had taken this route for years. It felt familiar, predictable. There was a comfort in that. He knew where the turns were, where the road dipped, where the street lamps flickered. Everything about it felt safe. Then he saw it flashing blue and red lights suddenly filling his rearview mirror. At first, he barely reacted. It was normal to see police cars rushing somewhere. But then the lights stayed behind him. And then the sound of a siren cut through the quiet evening air. The judge frowned slightly and slowed the car, checking his speed. He wasn't going fast. He wasn't breaking any laws. He wasn't doing anything unusual. Still, he signaled, pulled to the side, and stopped. For a moment, he just sat there in silence. He took a breath, steadying himself, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he knew what stops like this could sometimes become. He reached for his wallet, placed it on the passenger seat, kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, and waited. The police officer stepped out of his car. The judge could see him in the mirror, young, tall, stiff in his movements. The officer walked with a sense of urgency, as if he expected danger. His hand hovered near his belt, not grabbing anything, but close enough to show he was ready. When he reached the window, the officer motioned for the judge to lower it. The judge pressed the button slowly. The glass rolled down, and the cool afternoon air mixed with the officer's tense presence. "Good evening." "Officer," the judge said calmly. "License and registration," the officer replied sharply. Not returning the greeting. "May I ask why I was stopped?" The judge asked, keeping his tone light. "Polite. License and registration first," the officer repeated, his eyes scanning the interior of the car. The judge nodded, moved slowly, and picked up his wallet. "I am reaching for my ID," he said aloud, making sure every action was clear. The officer didn't say anything. He watched with a stiff jaw. After handing the documents over, the judge waited. The officer looked at the name, then at him, then at the car. His eyes narrowed a little. "This car," the officer said slowly, "matches the description of a stolen vehicle reported earlier today." The judge blinked in surprise. "Stolen? I've owned this car for years." The officer didn't react. "Please step out of the vehicle." The judge felt a sudden heaviness in his chest, a kind that did not come from guilt, but from tiredness and disappointment. He had done everything right. He was calm. He was respectful. He had broken no law. Yet here he was, being treated like a suspect. "Officer," he said carefully, "there must be a misunderstanding." "This car? Step out of the vehicle," the officer repeated, louder this time. The judge paused only for a brief second. Then he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. He stepped out slowly, keeping his hands visible. The officer gestured for him to stand near the front of the car. There were no pedestrians around, no noisy traffic, no distractions. Just the judge, the officer, and the fading evening light. The officer circled the car as if expecting to find something hidden. He ran the plates through his radio, glancing at the judge every few seconds. The judge stood still, his breathing steady but tightened by emotion. He wasn't angry, not yet. He was simply hurt. He had worked his entire life to be respected, to be known for fairness, for integrity, for calm judgment. And still, here he was, standing on the side of the road as if he were a criminal. The officer returned, holding the documents. "This car was reported stolen by a dealership earlier today," he said. "The person who took it claimed to be picking it up for a client." "I am the owner," the judge said firmly. "I bought it years ago. It is registered to me." "That's what you say," the officer muttered. The judge closed his eyes for a moment. He opened them again, choosing patience. "If you check the registration number in your system, you will see it matches my name. Everything will be clear." The officer hesitated. He seemed caught between suspicion and uncertainty. The judge saw it, the conflict in the officer's eyes, the pressure, the fear of making a mistake, yet the pride that kept him from slowing down. "Wait here," the officer said. He walked back toward his car, calling again on the radio. Minutes passed. Long, slow minutes. The judge looked around. The sky had turned deeper orange now. A couple of cars passed by, their drivers glancing curiously. One slowed down briefly before driving off. Another person walking a dog stopped far down the sidewalk, watching cautiously. The judge felt heat rise behind his eyes, not from shame, but from the weight of the situation. He knew what it looked like. A black man standing outside a luxury vehicle, a white officer questioning him. He had seen enough news stories to know how quickly people judged without knowing the truth. He wondered if any of them would guess he was a judge, someone who spent years upholding the law, someone who believed in fairness even when it was hard. The officer finally returned, but his expression was still stern. "The system confirms your name," he said, "but the report about the stolen car is still active." "That has nothing to do with me," the judge replied softly. "You can call the dealership, or check the purchase history, or speak to your supervisor." The officer didn't answer immediately. For the first time, he avoided eye contact. The judge noticed something was shifting, even if slightly. The officer then asked, "Do you have anything in the car I should know about?" The judge turned his head slowly, shocked by the question. "Like what?" "Anything illegal," the officer said stiffly. "I am a judge," the man replied gently, the words heavy with meaning. "My entire career has been built on the law." The officer's eyes widened slightly, just for a second. Not enough to show surprise openly, but enough for the judge to sense a crack in the wall of suspicion. "Judge?" The officer repeated quietly. "Yes," the man said. "I've been serving for many years." The officer swallowed hard. He seemed unsure of what to say. He looked at the documents again, as if hoping to see something he had missed before. The judge didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lash out. He simply waited. His calmness seemed to make the officer even more uneasy. A car drove past slowly. The driver rolled the window down slightly and stared. The judge looked away, not wanting to meet the stranger's eyes. He knew what moments like this did they planted seeds of rumors, assumptions, misunderstandings. The officer finally exhaled, long and strained. "I need to verify something," he said quietly this time. He stepped away again, speaking into his radio with a softer tone than before. His shoulders looked less stiff, as though the realization of who he had stopped had begun to settle in. The judge watched him, feeling a swirl of emotions he tried to control. He didn't want anger to take over. Anger created problems. Anger closed doors. He had spent years telling people in courtrooms to breathe, to respond thoughtfully, to choose calm over impulse. Now he had to take his own advice. People often believed judges lived separate from ordinary experiences, that they were shielded from uncomfortable situations. The truth was different. Judges were human. They felt fear, shame, exhaustion, loneliness. And sometimes they found themselves on the side of a quiet road, being asked if the car they paid for was really theirs. The officer walked back again, slower this time. The sound of gravel under his boots was the only noise between them. "I'm still waiting on confirmation," he said, though his voice lacked the earlier sharpness. The judge nodded. "Take your time." That response surprised the officer. He stopped walking, just for a moment, as if trying to understand how the man he had accused could still be so patient. The quiet stretched on. The judge looked up at the sky again. It had darkened into a deep shade, and the first star appeared faintly. He wondered how long this would continue. He wondered if he would reach home before dinner, or if he would have to tell someone from the courthouse what happened. He wondered if he should feel insulted or simply tired. Maybe both. He thought about all the people he had seen in court, people who sat nervously as he asked them questions, people who feared being judged unfairly. He suddenly felt closer to them than ever before. The officer's radio crackled loudly, breaking the silence. The officer listened, responded briefly, and then walked back toward the judge. His steps were slower, heavy with something that wasn't there before. The judge waited, steady as always. The officer stopped a few feet away, holding the documents tight. "Sir," he began, but his voice faded. He cleared his throat. "There might be a mistake in the report." The judge nodded once, quietly, already knowing. The officer lowered his gaze. "I'm still checking." The judge said nothing. He didn't need to. The moment hung between them awkward, strained, and filled with a truth neither wanted to speak aloud. The judge could already sense what was coming next. He could feel the shift in the officer's posture, the softness forming in his voice, the hesitation in his. The air around the roadside felt strangely heavy as the moments continued to stretch. The judge stood quietly near the front of his car, while the officer moved back and forth between his patrol vehicle and the judge's documents. Even though the officer's voice was now calmer, his body still held a tension that hinted he didn't quite know how to handle the situation anymore. The judge tried to keep himself composed. He looked at the ground, then at the sky, then back at the officer. He didn't want his emotions to spill out. It wasn't that he feared losing control, it was that he feared being misunderstood. He knew every small change in his tone or expression could be read the wrong way. So he stood with his hands folded softly in front of him, breathing slowly, letting the cool evening breeze wrap around him. After a few seconds, the officer finally spoke again. "Backup is on the way." The judge simply nodded. He didn't ask why. He didn't question it. He understood enough about how some situations unfolded. Once an officer felt uncertain, calling backup often felt safer, even if it wasn't necessary. A few cars slowed down as they passed, their drivers peeking out the window to see what was happening. The judge felt their eyes. He felt the weight of their assumptions. He wondered what story they might tell later at dinner about seeing a man pulled over beside an expensive car, about seeing officers surrounding someone who, from a distance, looked like a suspect. He knew none of them would ever guess that the man standing there had spent years making decisions that shaped entire courtrooms, that he had signed orders, delivered rulings, and guided countless people toward better choices. To them, he was just another person pulled over. The officer kept glancing at him, his expression shifting from suspicion to something closer to uncertainty. The judge noticed the slight tremble in the officer's hand whenever he adjusted his radio or touched the edge of his uniform. The officer wasn't just tense, he was conflicted. Minutes passed, slow and careful. Then, from far down the road, the faint sound of another siren grew louder. A second police car turned the corner and stopped behind the first one. The judge watched the new officer step out. This one looked older, calmer, someone who had probably dealt with many difficult situations and knew how to read a moment without jumping to conclusions. The older officer approached, gave a brief nod to the first officer, and then turned his gaze toward the judge. His eyes softened almost instantly, as if he recognized him. The judge saw the recognition but said nothing. He didn't want to speak before the officers did their part. The first officer began explaining the situation in a low voice, but the judge could still hear bits of it. Reported stolen, matches the description. Paperwork matches his name, but the older officer listened carefully. He didn't interrupt. He kept his arms relaxed at his sides. Unlike the first officer whose shoulders were tight, when the explanation finished, the older officer looked again at the judge with a thoughtful, puzzled expression. Then he stepped closer. "Sir," the older officer said gently, "may I confirm your identity?" The judge nodded and retrieved his ID card from the hood of his car, where the first officer had placed it earlier. The older officer took one look at the card, and his eyes widened more noticeably this time. Not in fear, but in recognition and respect. "You're a judge," the older officer said softly, almost under his breath. The younger officer stiffened. He turned his head sharply to look at the judge, then at the ID in the older officer's hand. The color drained from his face, as if the weight of the situation had just landed fully on him. The judge didn't speak. He simply waited, letting them process it. The older officer nodded slowly and handed the ID back with careful respect. "Sir, I believe there's been a misunderstanding." The judge gave a small sigh, but it wasn't angry. It was tired. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't know. The report said." The older officer raised a hand gently to stop him. It wasn't a scolding gesture, just a silent request to breathe. The older officer turned back to the judge. "We're going to sort this out right now. I'm calling the station to verify the dealership report." The judge nodded again. "I appreciate that." The older officer stepped away and began speaking into his radio. His tone was steady, unlike the younger officer's earlier tense communication. The judge could hear words like confirm, ownership record, and possible error. The younger officer stood a few steps away, avoiding eye contact. His breathing had changed. It was quicker now, almost shaky. The judge watched him quietly. He didn't want to embarrass the officer. He didn't want to accuse him. He simply wanted the moment to be handled with truth and dignity. Few minutes passed. The older officer returned with a calmer expression. "Sir, the dealership report is likely linked to another vehicle with a similar model and color. Yours is not the one involved. We're clearing the alert now." The younger officer closed his eyes briefly, a wave of relief, guilt, and discomfort washing over him. The judge didn't smile. He didn't speak. He waited for the rest. The older officer continued, "We apologize for the inconvenience. You're free to go." The judge nodded and reached for his documents on the hood of the car. The older officer handed them to him with both hands, a show of respect. The younger officer stepped forward a little, looking like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. The judge looked at the younger officer, waiting patiently. Finally, the younger officer swallowed and murmured, "Sir, He paused, searching for something honest. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I was just following the report." The judge held his gaze. For a moment, both men stood there in a quiet exchange that felt heavier than words. "I understand," the judge said softly. "But be careful. People can be hurt by assumptions." The younger officer looked down, not in shame, but in realization. "Yes, sir," he whispered. Silence returned between them, but it wasn't as tense as before. It felt different, now, like something had shifted in the officer's understanding. The judge turned slightly, resting his documents against his chest. "May I ask something?" The younger officer straightened. "Yes, sir. What made you think the car might be stolen? Was it only the report?" The judge's tone wasn't accusing. It was curious, genuine. The younger officer hesitated, struggling with how honest to be. The report. Yes. And, well, he exhaled. Sometimes we get calls about cars in this area. Suspicious activity. I didn't want to make a mistake again. Again? The judge asked gently. The older officer looked toward the younger one with concern, but said nothing. The younger officer nodded slowly. A few months ago, I let a driver go without checking everything properly. It turned out he had taken a car from a repair shop. I was warned for it. His voice softened. Since then, I've been extra careful. Maybe too careful. It can happen, the judge said quietly. But mistakes on the other side can also matter. The officer nodded again, his eyes lowered. A car drove by slowly, its driver slowing just enough to see what was happening. The judge watched the car pass. The officer noticed. You shouldn't have had to stand out here like this, the younger officer said, his voice trembling slightly. I'm sorry. The judge didn't respond right away. He let the apology float in the air for a moment. Then he said, What matters more than the stop is what you learn from it. The officer looked up, surprised by the gentle tone. I'll learn, he said quietly. I promise. The judge gave one small nod. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't rejection either. It was a moment of human understanding. The older officer stepped forward. Sir, would you like us to escort you or stay until you leave? No, the judge replied softly. I'll be fine. He walked around to the driver's side of his car, opened the door, and paused before getting in. He looked back at both officers. The older one stood respectfully, hands behind his back. The younger one stood with his hands by his sides, his posture less rigid now. More aware. The judge spoke quietly, with calm weight. Take care of yourselves, and take care of the people you stop. Everyone you meet is carrying a story. The younger officer nodded deeply, as if the words reached somewhere inside him. The judge got into his car, lowered the window, and set his seatbelt. The officer stepped back. He started the engine, the soft hum filling the quiet evening before driving off. He gave one final look at the younger officer. Something passed between them, a silent understanding that the moment had changed them, both in different ways. Then the judge rolled up the window, checked the mirror, and eased back onto the road. The flashing lights behind him slowly disappeared as distance grew between them. But the memory of the stop, that stayed with all three of them, knowing the story wasn't over yet. The judge drove slowly for the first few minutes after leaving the officers behind. His hands were steady on the wheel, but his mind was not. Even though the road ahead was clear, his thoughts felt crowded. He replayed the entire scene in his head, the flashing lights behind him, the officer's sharp tone, the tension in the air, the quiet apology at the end. Every detail sat with him like a weight he couldn't shrug off. He tried to breathe deeply, reminding himself he was safe now. The danger had passed, the misunderstanding had been cleared, and the evening sky was turning softer with shades of purple and blue. But something inside him still felt unsettled. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper, something like disappointment mixed with sadness. When he reached home, he parked the car and sat there for a moment before stepping out. The familiar comfort of his porch light should have eased his mind, but it didn't. He closed the door behind him, loosened his tie, and dropped his keys on the small wooden table near the entrance. The sound of the keys hitting the surface echoed louder than usual in the quiet house. He poured himself a glass of water and sat on the couch. He didn't turn on the TV, didn't open the book he planned to read, didn't check his phone. He just sat there, staring at nothing in particular, letting the heaviness in his chest settle. It wasn't the first time he had been treated differently on the road, but it had been a long time since something like this happened. And somehow, this time felt different. Maybe Because he was older now. Maybe because he had seen too many stories like this unfold. Maybe because, deep down, he expected the world to be different by now. He rubbed his forehead and closed his eyes. He knew he needed rest. But rest didn't come easy. Later that night, when he finally lay down, sleep drifted in and out like a shy visitor. He kept waking up, mind still replaying the same images, the officer's rigid stance, the way people stared, the weight of assumptions hanging in the air. The next morning came quietly. The sun rose slowly, casting pale gold light through his curtains. He sat up, stretched, and tried to shake off the heaviness of yesterday. He had work to do, hearings to prepare for, people depending on him to be steady and fair. As a judge, he always believed in giving people grace. He reminded himself that the young officer might have been acting out of fear, pressure, or inexperience. Still, the sting lingered. He dressed for work and left the house. The air outside was crisp, the kind that wakes you up whether you want it to or not. He got into his car and paused for a moment before starting the engine. He looked around, not because he was afraid, but because part of him still felt the echo of last night's lights in his rearview mirror. He reached the courthouse earlier than usual. The tall building stood calmly against the morning sky. He walked through the familiar hallways, nodding at the security staff and clerks. None of them had any idea what had happened the night before. To them, he was just the same calm, collected judge they saw every day. Inside his office, he sat down and opened his files. But it wasn't long before his thoughts drifted back to the officer, the young one with shaky hands and unsure eyes. He wondered how the officer felt afterward. Embarrassed? Guilty? Confused? Maybe all three. Later in the morning, during a short break between cases, the judge stepped outside to get some air. The courthouse courtyard was quiet, with only a few people passing by. He leaned against a stone railing and looked at the sky. That was when his phone buzzed. He pulled it out and saw a message from the courthouse administrator, asking if he was available to speak with someone. The message didn't say who, just that the person was asking politely and waiting in the lobby. Curious. The judge replied that he would be down shortly. Inside the lobby, standing near the front desk, was the young officer from the night before. The judge stopped walking, not out of fear or anger, but out of surprise. The officer stood there, holding his hat in both hands. His shoulders were no longer tense like the night before. His posture seemed almost humble. When the officer noticed the judge approaching, he straightened, but still looked nervous. "Good morning, sir," the officer said quietly. The judge nodded. "Good morning." The officer took a slow breath, as if gathering courage. I was hoping to speak with you. Just for a minute." The judge studied him. The officer's eyes were sincere, his voice steady but soft. There was no trace of arrogance, no defensiveness, only a deep need to correct something that had left him uneasy. "All right," the judge said. "We can step over here." They moved to a quieter corner of the lobby, where a few empty chairs lined the wall. The officer didn't sit. He stood with his hat pressed slightly against his chest. "Sir, I wanted to apologize again. Not just for last night, but for the way I handled things." The judge didn't interrupt. He simply listened. "I thought a lot about it," the officer continued. "And I realized I was. Too quick. Too tense. I didn't take a moment to see the situation clearly." He swallowed hard. "You were calm, respectful, and you kept your hands visible. I still treated you like you were hiding something." The judge nodded slightly. "What made you come here?" "I couldn't sleep," the officer admitted. "I kept thinking about how you stood there so calmly, even though I was treating you unfairly. You didn't yell. You didn't show anger. But I could see it affected you." He lowered his voice. "And it affected me too." The judge looked at him carefully. Most people wouldn't come the next day. I know, the officer said softly. But I didn't want the story to end there. I didn't want you to think all officers act like that. I didn't want my mistake to sit inside me without trying to fix it. The judge leaned slightly on the chair behind him. It's not about fixing last night. What matters is what you carry into the next stop. The officer nodded. I know, and I want to be better. There was a pause between them, silent, but full of honesty. Can I ask you something? The officer said. Of course, the judge replied. When I realized you were a judge, I felt shocked. But then I thought, what if you hadn't been? What if you were just someone driving home after work? Someone without a title? He hesitated. It made me feel worse. The judge took a slow breath. The question wasn't simple. It carried a weight many avoided. He answered softly, every person you stop deserves the same fairness. Not because of who they are, but because they are human. The officer looked down. You're right. The judge studied him for a moment longer. The young man genuinely wanted to learn. And maybe, just maybe, this moment could change how he approached every future decision. The judge finally said, sit down. The officer obeyed, lowering himself slowly into the seat beside him. Had still held tightly. The judge continued, let me tell you something. When I first became a judge, I made mistakes too. Not in the way you did, but mistakes that came from pressure, fear of doing the wrong thing, fear of being judged by others. I learned that the law isn't just rules. It's about people, their stories, their fears, their hopes. The officer listened intently, absorbing every word. You must remind yourself, every time you stop someone, the judge said, that the person in front of you is more than the moment you see them in. They may be tired from work. They may be scared. They may be stressed. Or they may be innocent and misunderstood. The officer's voice cracked slightly when he replied, I never thought of it like that. That's why you should slow down, the judge said gently. Not physically, but mentally. The officer nodded, his eyes shining with gratitude and something like relief. After a quiet moment, the officer said, I really appreciate you giving me this time. You asked, the judge said with a small smile. And I respect that. The officer stood, gently placing his hat under his arm. Thank you, sir. I won't forget this. The judge nodded, watching him walk away. The young officer paused at the door, turned slightly as if wanting to say something else, then simply gave a respectful nod before leaving the courthouse. The judge remained seated for a few seconds, letting the moment settle inside him. It had been unexpected, but meaningful. Something about the officer's sincerity eased the tension that had been gripping him since the night before. Later, as he returned to his office, he felt lighter. Not because everything had been resolved perfectly, but because steps toward understanding had been taken. That evening, when he drove home, he didn't feel the same weight pressing on his chest. The road felt like the same familiar stretch he had always known. The sky above looked peaceful, and for the first time since the incident, he allowed himself to breathe without thinking of flashing lights. But the story wasn't finished yet. Something in the young officer's eyes told him this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. The next morning began with a strange mix of tension and hope spreading through the courthouse halls. People whispered quietly as they walked past each other, their eyes shifting toward the courtroom where the internal hearing would take place. Word had spread fast about what happened on the roadside 2 days earlier. And although different people had different opinions, everyone understood that something important was about to unfold. The judge arrived early, much earlier than he needed to. He often liked having time to breathe before long days in court, but today felt different. Today felt heavier. He stood alone for a moment in the empty courtroom, holding the edge of the table and reminding himself that truth did not need decoration or protection. Truth only needed to be spoken clearly. He closed his eyes briefly, imagining the scene on the roadside. Again, the flashing lights, the officer's raised voice, the feeling of being judged before he had spoken a word. But he pushed it aside. He had promised himself he would not carry bitterness into this hearing. Only facts, only fairness. Across town, the officer stood in front of a mirror adjusting his uniform. His hands were steady, but his reflection told a different story. His eyes held a tightness that he couldn't hide. He had barely slept the night before. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the judge's calm face staring back at him after he made the accusation, the look of someone who had been through this before. Someone tired, but not broken. He wasn't proud of how he handled that stop. He wasn't proud of how quickly he jumped to a conclusion. But part of him still held on to the belief that he had followed procedure, at least the procedure he had been taught. And yet, even that belief wavered when he remembered how cold his words sounded, how defensive he became when the judge spoke politely, how much harder he pushed once he felt challenged. He felt anxious, and it wasn't the kind of anxiety he could explain away with training or instinct. It was deeper. It came with questions about himself that he didn't want to answer. When he finally walked out of his home and got into his patrol car, he realized his hands were gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. He loosened them slowly, but the tension didn't leave Dot by the time he reached the courthouse. There were already reporters standing outside, even though they weren't allowed inside. A few recognized him and began shouting questions, but he kept his head down and walked straight toward the entrance. Every step felt loud, even though the floor was silent beneath his boots. Inside the courtroom, people took their seats gradually. Lawyers, community members, a few officers, and a handful of court employees who were simply curious all sat quietly, watching every movement like it mattered. The judge sat on one end of the table, and the officer sat on the other. Between them sat a panel of 3 internal review members, people known for being fair, but also firm when needed. Their expressions gave nothing away. One of the panel members spoke first, welcoming everyone and explaining the purpose of the meeting, to review the events of the traffic stop, understand what happened, and decide what action, if any, needed to be taken. There was no punishment yet, no verdict, only a chance for truth. When the judge was invited to speak, he didn't rush. He didn't accuse. He didn't raise his voice. He simply described exactly what happened, every detail, from the moment he saw the lights in his mirror to the moment a passerby recognized him and changed everything. His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't trembling. It was steady, like someone used to explaining facts in difficult situations. He didn't focus on race. He didn't focus on humiliation. He focused on behavior, on assumptions, on how quickly the officer escalated something that didn't need escalation. He mentioned how he showed his registration first, how he tried to explain calmly, how he only identified himself after the situation grew tense, how the officer didn't seem interested in listening. Everyone in the room listened quietly. Some leaned forward. Some looked down. Some nodded without meaning to. The judge wasn't trying to win. He was trying to be understood. When he finished, there was a long silence. Not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. Then it was the officer's turn. He cleared his throat before speaking, but the first words still came out rougher than he intended. He took a moment to breathe, then tried again, this time softer. He began by explaining his training, his experience with stolen vehicles, and how he had been told to be alert for certain patterns. But as he spoke, he realized how weak those explanations sounded when said out loud in a quiet room, filled with people who knew the law. After a pause, he said something that made the room hold still, I wasn't just reacting to the situation, he admitted. I was reacting to my assumptions. I didn't even realize it at the moment. I thought I was doing what I was supposed to do. But I look back now, and I see how wrong it was. No one interrupted him. Even the air seemed to pause. I shouldn't have talked to him the way I did, he continued. I shouldn't have escalated things. And I shouldn't have assumed he didn't belong in that car. I've replayed that moment over and over, and every time I do, I see how many chances I had to slow down and think. His voice didn't break, but it softened, losing the stiffness it normally carried. I'm not proud of it, he said quietly. But I'm here because I want to understand what led me to act like that. I want to fix it. The room stayed quiet for a few seconds more before the panel members asked their questions. They were not harsh, but they were direct, asking about procedure, tone, perception, and alternatives the officer could have taken. He answered honestly. Sometimes uncomfortably, sometimes uncertainly, but truthfully. After nearly an hour of discussion, the panel called for a short break so they could review everything privately. The judge walked out first, breathing in the hallway's cool air. The officer walked out after him, keeping distance, but glancing his way briefly. It wasn't hostility in the glance. It wasn't fear either. It was something closer to acknowledgement. The judge noticed, but didn't react. He simply stood still, waiting for whatever came next. Down the hallway, a few people approached him to offer support. A clerk told him she admired his calmness. A lawyer thanked him for being patient during the hearing. He appreciated the words, but he didn't rely on them. He was focused on the bigger picture. Across the hall, the officer sat alone on a bench. His head leaned back against the wall as he stared at the ceiling, replaying the hearing like it was happening again. He wondered what the panel would decide. He wondered what would happen to his career. But more than that, he wondered why it took this incident for him to question things he should have questioned long ago. After 20 minutes, the panel called everyone back inside. The room grew quiet again as the panel members took their seats. The lead member began speaking in a calm, steady tone. She started by acknowledging the seriousness of the incident, emphasizing that authority must always be balanced with responsibility and respect. She spoke about the importance of unbiased judgment, about community trust, and about accountability. Then she turned to the judge and thanked him for his professionalism and clarity throughout the hearing. When she faced the officer, her tone remained firm but not accusatory. We find that your actions during the traffic stop were influenced by assumptions rather than evidence, she said. We also recognize your honesty today and your willingness to examine your own behavior. She explained that disciplinary action would be taken, not termination, but a temporary suspension combined with mandatory training, mentorship, and community engagement work. It wasn't light, but it wasn't career-ending either. It was a chance for growth, not punishment alone. The officer nodded slowly, accepting it without argument. The judge listened carefully, but did not show satisfaction or disappointment. He simply accepted the decision as fair. After the hearing ended, people began gathering their things to leave. Some approached the judge, some approached the officer, and some quietly walked out with thoughtful expressions. As the judge walked toward the hallway, he heard footsteps behind him. When he turned slightly, he saw the officer approaching cautiously, not too close, but close enough to talk. Thank you for how you handled everything, the officer said quietly. You didn't have to be that patient with me. But you were. The judge studied him for a moment. The officer looked sincere, tired, humbled. I didn't do it for you, the judge said gently. I did it because fairness is the only thing that keeps our system from collapsing. The officer nodded, taking in the words. I want to do better, he said. Not because I got in trouble, but because I finally see what I didn't want to see before. The judge didn't smile, but his expression softened just a little. Then start by listening, he said. Really listening. It makes more difference than you think. The officer nodded again, taking the words seriously. As they both turned to leave, something shifted, not friendship, not forgiveness, but understanding. A small step. A beginning. Outside, the crowd of reporters had grown larger. The moment the judge appeared, microphones swung in his direction. But he didn't speak to them. He simply walked past, calm and steady, ignoring the noise around him. Behind him, the officer stepped outside as well. Reporters turned toward him too, but he kept his head down and walked straight to his car. This wasn't a moment for cameras. It was a moment for reflection. As the judge got into his own car, the same car that had started this entire try. The days after the internal hearing moved slowly, almost like the city itself had paused to think. News of the incident had spread beyond the courthouse. And while people discussed it everywhere on street corners, in coffee shops, online, most conversations were gentle, reflective, not heated like many expected. It seemed the way both men handled the situation had surprised the community. Softening the usual sharp edges of public debate, the judge went back to his usual routine, though something in his days felt different now. He noticed how people looked at him a little longer when he walked through the courthouse or the parking lot. Some nodded at him with a kind of quiet respect. Others simply watched from a distance, unsure if they should say anything. He didn't mind either reaction. He wasn't seeking attention. All he wanted was normalcy, something he hadn't felt fully since the roadside stop. One morning, as he walked toward his chambers, he passed by a group of young law interns who had obviously been waiting to speak to him. They stepped toward him, nervous but eager. The oldest of the group cleared his throat and said they had been following the hearing and were inspired by how calmly the judge handled everything. They asked if he would consider speaking to their training group about how to handle difficult situations with dignity. He paused, looking at the hopeful faces in front of him. Their request wasn't for praise or gossip. They genuinely wanted to learn. So he agreed, telling them to set up a date. As they walked away, whispering excitedly, he couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of responsibility settle over him. Maybe his experience, painful as it was, could help shape something better for the next generation of legal minds. Across town, the officer was living through his own shift in perspective. His suspension began the day after the hearing. He wasn't thrilled about being away from work, but he accepted it. He understood why it was necessary. The first week felt uncomfortable, like he was facing a blank wall and didn't know what to do with his time. For years, the job had defined him. Without the badge, without the routine, he felt strangely exposed, but the department required him to attend training sessions during the suspension. Sessions focused on communication, bias awareness, and community connection. He didn't expect much from them at first. He assumed they'd be filled with basic reminders he had heard before. But during the first meeting, he found himself listening in a way he hadn't listened in years. The trainer was an older man with a calm voice and a gentle way of speaking that encouraged honesty. Instead of lecturing the officers about what they should or shouldn't do, he asked them questions. Real questions. Personal questions. Questions they couldn't answer with simple rules. What assumptions do you carry that you have never challenged? What moments haunt you from the job, not because of danger, but because of regret? What do you fear others might think of you if you admitted the mistakes you've made? No one was forced to answer out loud, but the silence that followed felt heavy with truth. The officer felt something shift inside him again. Something he didn't expect to feel, an uncomfortable mix of guilt, recognition, and curiosity. He drove home that evening with the windows down, letting the cold air push through the car. It was the first time he allowed himself to think deeply about how many decisions in his career had been influenced by habit rather than understanding. How many moments he had rushed instead of observing. How many times he had acted like authority meant certainty, even when he wasn't certain at all. The next day, he attended a different kind of session, this one led by community members, who volunteered to share stories about their experiences with law enforcement. The officer listened quietly as people described moments when they felt ignored, misunderstood, or judged unfairly. No one shouted. No one accused him personally. They simply shared their stories, trusting that someone in the room would choose to hear them. He watched their faces as they spoke, faces filled with determination, vulnerability, and hope. For the first time, he saw the connection between fear and respect. He understood how his actions, even when following protocol, could leave marks on people long after the moment passed. He began taking notes, not because he had to, but because he wanted to remember what he heard. He didn't want any of it to fade by the end of the week. He felt something he hadn't felt since he first joined the force, a desire to be better, not just as an officer, but as a person. Meanwhile, the judge continued his work with a steadiness that others admired. Every case he handled was approached with the same calm voice and thoughtful presence he had become known for. But beneath that calmness, he carried the memory of the roadside stop with him, nothing dramatic, just a reminder of how quickly life could shift. One afternoon, after finishing a case earlier than expected, he decided to take a walk outside the courthouse. The sun was warm, and the breeze carried the sound of traffic from the busy street nearby. He walked toward a small park across from the courthouse, a place where office workers often ate lunch or took breaks. He sat on a bench for a moment, just watching life move around him. A few minutes later, a woman with a laptop approached him politely and asked if he had a moment. He recognized her from a local newspaper. She was always careful with her reporting, always respectful. She asked if he would be willing to give a short interview, not about the conflict or the hearing, but about how he remained calm and patient during stressful moments on and off the bench. She said people admired the way he handled the situation, and she wanted to focus on the lesson, not the incident itself. He hesitated, unsure whether he wanted to speak publicly again. But after a moment, he agreed, mostly because he valued her approach. She didn't want drama. She wanted understanding. They talked for nearly an hour. He didn't speak about the officer with anger. He didn't paint himself as a hero. He simply shared his philosophy, that patience protects truth, that calmness prevents conflict from growing larger than it needs to be, and that every person deserves a chance to be heard. When she finished taking notes, she thanked him warmly and promised to write the article with the care it deserved. As she walked away, he noticed a young man sitting at a nearby table, staring at him with wide eyes. When their eyes met, the young man stood up and walked over. He introduced himself, saying he was in his final year of college and planning to apply to law school. He told the judge that watching how he handled the situation had changed the way he looked at the legal system. He said it made him believe that fairness still had a place in the world. The judge smiled gently and wished him luck. After the young man walked away, he sat quietly again, feeling a warmth in his chest that wasn't pride, exactly something softer. Like purpose, a few days later, the officer had his first community engagement event, something he wasn't sure how to prepare for. He was nervous as he pulled into the community center parking lot. He wasn't wearing his uniform. He had been instructed to come in plain clothes, so people would feel comfortable talking to him. Inside the building, he saw a mix of families, teenagers, elders, and volunteers chatting casually. A coordinator approached him with a friendly smile and introduced him to a circle of people who were part of a mentorship program. They shook his hand politely, but with caution, unsure of what to expect from him. He expected awkwardness, maybe even resentment, but the conversation began gently. People asked him basic questions: how long he had been an officer, what he liked about the job, what challenges he faced. He answered honestly, sometimes awkwardly, but sincerely. Then one of the teenagers asked him a harder question. A question that made him pause. What made you decide to change? He swallowed slowly, thinking before he spoke. I saw myself in a moment I didn't like, he said quietly. I realized I wasn't becoming the kind of person I wanted to be. And once you see that clearly, you can't pretend you don't. You have to make a choice. The teenager nodded, not in approval, but in understanding that another person in the group asked him if he felt embarrassed about the hearing. He nodded without hesitation. Yes, he said. And maybe that's good. Sometimes you need to be uncomfortable to grow. The group listened closely, and little by little, the room's tension dissolved. They began sharing their own stories, stories of being misunderstood, judged too quickly, or treated unfairly. He listened, truly listened, with none of the defensiveness he might have felt before. By the end of the evening, he walked out of the center feeling lighter than he had in months. For the first time, he felt connected not as an officer, not as someone in authority, but just as a person trying to understand other people. As the week went on, both men continued their separate paths, unaware that their paths would cross again, sooner than expected. On a quiet Friday afternoon, the judge returned to the park bench where he had been interviewed. He sat there, enjoying the warm sunlight, when he heard someone approach slowly. He looked up and saw the officer standing a few feet away, hesitant but determined. The officer asked if he could sit. The judge nodded. Neither spoke for a few seconds. It wasn't uncomfortable, just calm. The officer finally said he wanted to thank the judge again, not just for the hearing, but for the way he carried himself afterward. He said the training sessions and community work had opened his eyes, and he hoped he could continue learning even after the suspension ended. The judge nodded, listening. A few weeks passed quietly, but the calm didn't last. Life has a way of testing the lessons people claim they've learned, and for the officer and the judge, that test arrived one chilly evening when the sky was dim and the streets were crowded with after-work traffic. The judge had stayed late at the courthouse finishing paperwork. It wasn't unusual, but he felt more tired than normal. His mind had been full lately. Cases, people seeking advice, students asking to shadow him, news outlets wanting to interview him, and the quiet burden of the roadside incident still sitting somewhere in the back of his thoughts. When he finally stepped outside and walked toward the parking lot, the air felt heavier, almost like a storm was hiding behind the clouds. He unlocked his car, placed his briefcase on the passenger seat, and was about to start the engine when something caught his eye. Across the lot, near the far corner, two young men were shouting at each other. Their voices were sharp and angry, echoing across the quiet evening. At first, he considered driving away. The situation didn't involve him, and he was exhausted. But then he noticed something else. One of the men looked frightened, backing away slowly with his hands raised. The judge sighed softly, knowing he couldn't ignore it. He stepped out of his car and called out in a calm, firm voice that carried just enough authority to catch their attention. Is everything all right? Both men turned toward him. One glared angrily, while the other looked relieved. The angry one took a step forward, shouting something the judge couldn't fully hear, but the tension in his voice was clear. This could escalate quickly. Just as the judge opened his mouth to speak again, headlights swept across the lot. A police car pulled in fast, brakes screeching slightly as it came to a stop only a few feet away. The door swung open, and the officer stepped out. But this time, it wasn't just any officer. It was him, the same officer who had stopped the judge weeks earlier. The same man who had been attending training, meeting with the community, and trying to reshape his habits. He recognized the judge instantly. The judge recognized him too, for a split second, Both men froze not in discomfort, but in awareness of how strange life could be. Then something remarkable happened. The officer didn't rush forward. He didn't shout. He didn't place his hand on his belt. He simply raised his palm gently and said in a steady voice, "Let's slow down here. No one needs to be hurt." The angry young man turned toward the officer, his eyes burning with frustration, but the officer didn't let the moment slip. He stayed calm, shoulders relaxed, voice even. "What's going on?" he asked. The young man pointed angrily at the other, claiming he had been insulted, disrespected, threatened. The frightened one insisted he hadn't done anything, saying he had only asked for directions before things spiraled. The officer nodded slowly, absorbing the details without assuming either was guilty. He didn't judge. He didn't accuse. He listened, really listened, the very thing he promised himself he would learn to do. The judge stepped closer, keeping his voice low and non-threatening. "Let's take a breath," he said to both young men. "You're upset. We understand. But anger grows fast if we don't pause." The angry one glared again, but didn't step forward this time. He looked at the judge, then at the officer, then back at the judge. Something in their calmness softened him just a little. The officer spoke again, gently this time. "Why don't we step to the side and talk this out? No rush, no pressure. Just talk." It took a few moments, but eventually the tension settled enough for the officer to guide both men apart and speak to them individually. The judge watched quietly, seeing the difference in the officer's manner, the way he asked questions, the way he nodded carefully, the way he avoided assumptions. After a few minutes, the officer returned to the judge with a relieved sigh. "It was a misunderstanding," he explained. "They're both upset, but nobody meant real harm. Just quick tempers." The judge nodded slowly, observing the young men calming down in the distance. "You handled that well," he said. The officer gave a modest shrug. "I tried to remember what we talked about. Slowing down, listening, letting people breathe." The judge smiled gently. "It shows." He meant it. He truly did. As the officer prepared to walk back to his car, he paused and turned around. "You know," he said quietly, "I think you being here made a difference, too." The judge lifted an eyebrow. "How so?" "You carry calmness like it's part of you," the officer said. "People feel it the moment you speak." The judge chuckled softly. "It's not magic. It's patience." The officer nodded again, thoughtful. But the night wasn't done teaching lessons. Just as they were about to part ways, a sudden shout cut through the air. One of the young men had started arguing with someone new, a man who had just walked through the lot talking loudly on the phone. The angry young man, already unsettled, misunderstood something the newcomer said and took it as an insult. Before either the judge or the officer could react, the argument exploded again. This time, the newcomer stepped forward aggressively, clearly annoyed by the shouting. His voice grew louder, and his stance became confrontational. The officer moved faster now, but still with calm steps. He placed himself between them, turned slightly so neither felt cornered, and raised both hands gently. "Let's stop right here," he said, voice low but clear. "No one is in trouble. Just breathe." The newcomer was stubborn, muttering angrily under his breath. The officer didn't snap back or lecture him. Instead, he asked him to talk to him privately, just a few steps away, giving him space to be heard. The judge watched the scene with quiet admiration. The officer's training, reflection, and growth were visible in every move he made. His approach wasn't perfect. It was human, but it was different. Better. Thoughtful. After a tense minute or two, the newcomer's shoulders relaxed, and he finally nodded. The officer guided him away, speaking softly until the tension faded. With the situation under control, the officer returned to the judge one more time. I almost lost it for a second, he admitted. The old me, the one who would have raised my voice, that part of me still lives somewhere. I felt it trying to come out. But it didn't, the judge said. And that's what matters. The officer exhaled slowly. I'm still learning. We all are, the judge replied. The parking lot grew quiet again. The young men dispersed, mumbling apologies. The newcomer left shaking his head, but calmer than before. The officer took a moment to sit on the curb, running a hand through his hair. The judge joined him, sitting beside him without saying a word. They sat together watching the clouds moving across the dim sky. Finally, the officer spoke softly. You know, if this happened a month ago, I would have handled it completely differently. The judge nodded knowingly. People don't change overnight. But you've taken real steps. You're choosing to be better, even when it's uncomfortable. The officer stared ahead for a moment before turning slightly toward the judge. I'm glad you are here tonight. And I'm glad you were, the judge replied. There was no dramatic music, no cheering crowd, just two men, shaped by complicated circumstances, quietly acknowledging each other's growth under a flickering parking lot light dot as they stood up to leave. The officer paused one last time. I know we had a rough start, he said, but I want you to know that day changed me, and I'm grateful for it now, even though I wasn't then. The judge placed his hands in his coat pockets, thoughtful. And I'm grateful too, he said, not for what happened, but for what came after. They exchanged a small, respectful nod, one that didn't erase the past, but honored the progress. The officer walked toward his patrol car. The judge walked toward his own car, the same car that had caused suspicion weeks earlier, now sitting quietly under the dim lights, like it had nothing to do with anything at all. As the judge opened the door, he paused and looked back one more time. The officer sat in his patrol car, hands resting on the steering wheel. But this time, they weren't tight. They were steady, relaxed, ready. The judge smiled to himself, not a wide smile, but a subtle one, filled with a sense of closure and hope. When he started the engine and drove out of the lot, he carried something new with him, not fear, not bitterness, but a gentle reminder that change is possible, even in the most unexpected places. And as the officer watched the judge's car fade into the distance, he felt something unusual, too, a feeling of peace, the kind that comes after learning something important about yourself. The night ended quietly, without tension, without anger, just understanding. And in that quiet, both men carried forward the lessons life had forced them to learn, not as a judge and an officer, not as opponents, but as two people who met in conflict and walked away changed for Eve.